A car spun sideways, headlights still burning into an empty gravel road. The keys are in the ignition, the driver isn't. A boy's shoes, still tied, sitting empty in a field 200 miles from home. A passport, a wallet, a phone, left behind on an airport clinic floor by a man who was never seen again. A voice on a phone call, calm, describing lights in the distance, lights that, months later, investigators would prove he was never actually looking at. And a bar's only camera, watching every door, except the one that mattered. 5 people, 5 nights. 5 cases where the evidence doesn't lead to an answer, it leads to another question. In every one of these files, there's a single piece of proof that something happened. A locked door that shouldn't have been locked. A stain that shouldn't be where it is. A silence that shouldn't have been silent. And in every one of these cases, investigators believe they are one missing variable away from knowing exactly what happened. We're going to go through all 5 tonight. Stick around, because by the end, you're going to have your own theory about which of these is the strangest, and I guarantee it's not going to be the one you expect going in. Welcome back to the channel. Today's case files: Jason Landry, Timothy Pitzen, Lars Mittank, Brandon Swanson, and Brian Shaffer. 5 vanishings, 5 trails that go cold at the exact moment they should have gone somewhere. If you're new here, consider subscribing and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into the first case. Jason Landry. Jason Landry was 21 years old, a sound recording technology student at Texas State University, and on the night of December 13th, 2020, all he was trying to do was get home. He just wrapped his first semester back after a rough stretch of pandemic isolation, said goodbye to his roommates, packed up his laptop and his gaming console and his backpack, and at 10:55 p.m., he pulled out of his apartment complex in San Marcos and pointed his Nissan Altima south, toward his parents' house in Missouri City. It was a drive he'd made before, 2.5 hours give or take. Nothing about it should have been remarkable. For the first 29 minutes, it wasn't. His phone pinged off towers along Highway 80 in a straight, unbroken line. He passed under Interstate 35. He crossed into Caldwell County. He drove through Martindale, through Fentress, through Prairie Leah, through Stairtown, each town blinking by in a minute or two of empty highway. At 11:24 p.m., he crossed into the city limits of Luling, Texas, and it's this exact minute where the story stops being simple. At 11:24, Jason's phone shows he closed out of Waze. He'd been navigating the whole drive, the same way anyone does on a familiar route they don't quite trust themselves to remember, and in the same minute he closed it, he opened Snapchat. Whatever he did on it was brief. A few minutes later, his digital footprint goes quiet at the intersection of Austin Street and Magnolia Avenue, the exact turn that would have carried him onto Highway 183 and eventually Interstate 10, the road that leads home. He didn't take it. Instead, investigators believe he continued straight, off the paved road entirely, onto a narrow stretch of gravel called Salt Flat Road. This is where it stops making sense. Salt Flat Road isn't a shortcut. It isn't on the way to anywhere Jason was going. It's a utility road that cuts through oil and ranch land, the kind of road only locals, landowners, and pump crews have any reason to be on. And somewhere in the first few miles of it, in the pitch dark, driving on loose gravel he had never driven on before, Jason lost control of his car. At 12:31 a.m., a volunteer firefighter driving home from his shift came across the wreck. The Altima had spun, its back end catching a tree hard enough to total the rear of the vehicle. The headlights were still on, the engine had been switched off, but the keys were still sitting in the ignition, and the front passenger door, for reasons nobody has ever been able to explain, was locked shut. The firefighter didn't go near the car, he called it in and kept driving. It would be almost half an hour before a state trooper arrived, and when he didn't search the vehicle either. It was hooked up to a tow truck and hauled to an impound lot, and for the rest of that night, the crash site sat completely empty. No tape, no search team, no one looking for Jason at all. The people who ended up processing that scene weren't investigators. They were his parents. At around 5:30 that morning, Jason's father, Kent, drove out to the impound yard alone, and inside the totaled Altima, wedged down between the driver's seat and the center console, he found his son's cell phone. Then he drove out to Salt Flat Road itself, to the exact stretch where the crash happened, because nobody from law enforcement had thought to seal it off or preserve it. And there, scattered roughly 900 feet from where the car had come to rest, he found the rest of it: a backpack, a ball cap, a bag of toiletries, a tumbler holding Jason's pet fish, dead, and a little further down, folded rather than strewn, Jason's clothes, his shirt, his shorts, his socks and underwear, his sandals, his watch. All of it laid out roughly where he would have been walking if he'd started back toward town on foot, and all of it left behind as if he never intended to need any of it again. When the clothing was finally turned over and tested, investigators found a small amount of blood on the shorts, but it was minor, the kind of spot that comes from a scratch, not a wound, nothing that pointed to any kind of struggle. No blood at all was found inside the vehicle itself. The backpack held a laptop, gaming equipment, his wallet, and a small, personal amount of marijuana. Nowhere near the quantity later, inaccurate reports would claim. And that detail, small as it was, seems to have shaped the entire early direction of this case. Officers on scene floated the idea that Jason might have wandered off in some kind of drug-induced state, undressed and disoriented in the middle of a cold December night. His family has never accepted that explanation, and the physical evidence has never fully supported it either. Nothing about how his clothes were left behind, folded rather than torn, positioned rather than scattered, reads like a young man in a state of crisis. It reads like something else. Nobody has ever been able to say what. What's left is a 67-minute gap. 67 minutes between the last confirmed activity on Jason's phone and the moment his crashed car was discovered on the side of that gravel road. In that window, somehow, his vehicle traveled 4 unexplained miles down a road it had no reason to be on, crashed hard enough to disable it, and its driver vanished into the dark without his phone, without his backpack, and eventually without his clothes, all of it left in a rough, deliberate-looking trail behind him. In the years since, the investigation has changed hands more than once. The Caldwell County Sheriff's Office ran the case initially, and in 2022, at the request of local investigators themselves, the Texas Attorney General's Cold Case and Missing Persons Unit took it over. They've pulled in digital forensics experts, accident reconstructionists, and a geofence warrant for the area surrounding the crash site. They've searched oil tanks in the surrounding fields. They've reviewed hundreds of hours of security footage from businesses around Luling. And after all of that, the official position has remained the same. A single vehicle accident, no evidence of a second car, no evidence Jason had arranged to meet anyone in the area, and no evidence after 5 years of what happened to him next. As of 2026, Jason Landry has been missing for more than 5 years. His parents still hold a candlelight vigil every December on Salt Flat Road, at the same spot where his car came to rest. A $20,000 reward remains active through the Texas Attorney General's office for anyone with information that leads to answers. And the case remains open, still built entirely around that one impossible 67 minutes, the gap between a boy driving home for Christmas and a pile of folded clothes left behind on a gravel road in the dark. Timothy Pitzen, his name carries a small, easy-to-miss detail that almost nobody gets right on the first try. Not Timothy. Timothy. 2 M's deliberately placed there by his mother, and that detail alone tells you something about how the story that follows unfolded. Because everything about what happened to this 6-year-old boy was deliberate, planned days in advance, right down to the spelling investigators would later type into missing persons bulletins. Timothy James Pitzen was born on October 18, 2004, in Aurora, Illinois, the only child of James Pitzen and his wife, Amy Fry Pitzen. By the spring of 2011, Timothy was 6 years old and in kindergarten, and by every account, a happy kid. His parents' marriage, however, was not happy. It was buckling under years of strain, worsened by Amy's ongoing struggles with depression and mental illness, worsened further by a fear, one she voiced to people close to her, that if the marriage ended, she wouldn't be the one who kept custody of her son. On the morning of Wednesday, May 11, 2011, James Pitzen dropped Timothy off at Greenman Elementary School. Like any other school day, he had no idea it would be the last time he would ever do so. Somewhere between 8:10 and 8:15 that same morning, Amy arrived at the school, told staff there had been a family emergency, and signed her son out of class. There was no emergency. There was, instead, a plan already in motion. Amy's first stop was a car repair shop, where she dropped off her vehicle at 10 o'clock and had an employee drive her and Timothy to the Brookfield Zoo, one of Timothy's favorite places. From there, The trip took on the unmistakable shape of a vacation. That evening, they checked into the Key Lime Cove Water Resort in Gurnee, a hotel built around an indoor water park, and spent the night. The next day, Thursday, they drove roughly 165 miles north to the Kalahari Resort in Wisconsin Dells, stopping along the way at stores to buy Timothy clothes, toys, snacks. Nothing about any of it looked like an abduction. It looked, to anyone watching, like a mother spoiling her son on an impromptu getaway. Friday morning, May 13th, security cameras at the Kalahari captured Amy and Timothy checking out of the resort together. He's seen holding her hand, glancing into his backpack, visibly bored the way any 6-year-old gets bored standing in a checkout line. It is the last confirmed image of Timothy Pitzen that exists. From there, Amy began driving south, roughly 170 miles, back down through Illinois. And somewhere between noon and 1:30 that afternoon, she pulled over and made a series of phone calls, not to her husband, but to her own mother and to her brother-in-law, telling them that she and Timothy were safe. Cell tower data placed those calls in an area northwest of Sterling, Illinois, near Route 40. Timothy could be heard in the background of more than one of them. At one point, he got on the phone himself and told a family member he was hungry. It's a small, mundane detail, a tired kid wanting food, and it is also the last time anyone outside of Amy ever heard his voice. After those calls, Amy turned her phone off. What happened between that early afternoon phone call and her reappearance later that evening remains the single largest gap in the entire case. The hours investigators have spent nearly a decade and a half trying to account for. She's next seen on camera at 7:25 that evening, alone, at a Family Dollar store in Winnebago, Illinois, and again around 8 o'clock at a nearby grocery store, buying paper and writing supplies. Timothy is not with her in either of those recordings, and he has not been seen since. At 11:15 that night, Amy checked into the Rockford Inn in Rockford, Illinois. Sometime that night or in the early hours of the following morning, she took her own life, ending her life by cutting her wrists and throat and compounding it with an intentional overdose of antihistamines. At 12:30 in the afternoon on Saturday, May 14th, a hotel housekeeper found her body, along with a note. The knife recovered at the scene carried only her own blood, no one else's. The note in the room, and a second one that arrived days later by mail, addressed not to her husband but to her mother and a close friend, said in essence the same thing. That she was sorry for the mess, that she had never quite felt like she belonged in the world, and that Timothy was safe, cared for by people who loved him, and that he would never be found. That single sentence has defined every year of this investigation since. Because the evidence around it doesn't cleanly point toward a murder, investigators did find a concerning amount of blood in the back of Amy's SUV, and it was confirmed through testing to belong to Timothy. For a moment, that looked like the answer no one wanted. But a family member later explained the stains were consistent with a nosebleed Timothy had suffered in that same vehicle weeks earlier, well before any of this began, and investigators found nothing else in the car, no additional trace evidence, no indication of violence toward the boy. What they did find was that the vehicle had, at some point during that missing window on Friday, been parked in a grassy, undeveloped area, possibly near a stream, and close to a highway, exactly the kind of nondescript rural pull-off that exists by the thousands across northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, and exactly the kind of location that has never been narrowed down to one specific spot. What was also missing was almost as telling as what was found. Amy's cell phone was never recovered. Neither was Timothy's backpack, nor the toys purchased for him along the trip. And months after her death, investigators uncovered a secret email account Amy had created under her maiden name, one her husband had no knowledge of, raising the possibility that she'd had contact entirely off the family's radar with someone else. Records also showed Amy had made 2 unexplained trips to the Sterling, Dixon, and Rock Falls area months before the disappearance, trips her own family could not account for. To this day, no one has identified who, if anyone, she may have met there. That single sentence in her note, that Timothy was safe and cared for, has kept an entire theory alive for 14 years. That rather than harming her son, Amy handed him off to someone she trusted in or around Sterling before returning alone to end her own life. It's a theory his family holds on to, publicly and firmly, refusing to accept the alternative. That hope has also made the case a target. In April of 2019, a young man in Newport, Kentucky was found wandering the streets, disoriented, and told police he was Timothy Pitzen, that he'd escaped captors who had held him for years. For a brief, agonizing window, it seemed the impossible had happened. Federal agents were brought in, DNA samples were taken, and within a day, the truth came out. The man was not Timothy. He was an Ohio man with a long criminal record who had seen a television special on the case and decided, in his own words, that he wanted to get away from his own family. He was charged federally, pleaded guilty to aggravated identity theft, and in December of 2020 was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison plus a year of probation, a conviction that stands as one of the clearest warnings on record of what it costs to exploit a family's unresolved grief. Timothy Pitzen has now been missing for over a decade and a half. There is no body. There is no confirmed crime scene beyond a rural pull-off that has never been precisely located. There is only a note, a silence that begins the moment his mother switched off her phone northwest of Sterling, and a single unproven sentence promising that somewhere he is safe. Lars Mittank. Lars Mittank was 28 years old, a German national from Berlin, and in the summer of 2014, he did something he had genuinely never done before. He left the country. This trip to the Golden Sands Resort near Varna, Bulgaria, with 5 of his friends, was his first time ever setting foot outside of Germany. By every account from the people who were there with him, the week itself was completely unremarkable in the best possible way. They lay on the beach, they swam, they played football on the sand, and went out clubbing at night. His friends would later describe him as relaxed, in a good mood, nothing at all like a man on the edge of vanishing. Then came the 6th of July, the night before the group was scheduled to fly home. Lars and his friends were out at a bar in town when a disagreement broke out with another group of German tourists, a dispute rooted in nothing more serious than rival football clubs. Words were exchanged, the two groups separated, and at some point that night, Lars split off from his own friends and disappeared into the town alone. They wouldn't see him again until the following morning. When he did resurface at the resort, he told his friends he'd been jumped. The details of exactly who attacked him have never fully lined up. Some friends were told it was the same men from the bar, others were told it was locals the group had paid to do it, but whatever the truth, Lars came back with real injuries, a badly bruised jaw and a ruptured eardrum. A local doctor examined him, told him flying home with an injury like that was a bad idea, and prescribed him a 500 milligram course of the antibiotic cefprozil to guard against infection. His friends offered to stay behind with him. Lars told them not to bother. He insisted he'd be fine on his own and sent them home on their original flight as planned. It's a decision that, in hindsight, none of them have ever stopped thinking about. Lars checked out of the resort at the same time they did and checked into a separate, considerably cheaper hotel near the airport, a place called the Hotel Color, intending to rest for a night or two before flying out himself. It's from this point forward that the story starts to unravel into something none of his friends or family recognized. While alone in that hotel, Lars began calling his mother, Sandra, back in Germany, and what he told her was frightening. He said people were trying to kill him. He told her he was hiding. He asked her to cancel his credit cards. Security footage from inside the hotel corroborates just how serious this shift was, showing him pacing the hallways at night, checking over his shoulder, ducking in and out of the elevator as if he were actively evading someone. At one point, he left the hotel entirely around 1 in the morning and vanished for several hours, only to return without any explanation for where he'd been. Despite all of this, Lars still made the decision to go home. On the morning of July 8, 2014, he sent his mother a text, letting her know he'd made it to the airport. Before he could board any flight, though, Bulgarian regulations required him to be formally cleared to fly given his injury, so he went to see the airport's on-site physician, a doctor named Kosta Kostov. Dr. Kostov later described the consultation as tense from the start. He said Lars seemed nervous and erratic, and that he examined him and told him plainly that he was fit to travel. But Lars didn't leave the office. Instead, he lingered, pressing the doctor with questions about the medication he'd been given, seemingly unconvinced that it was safe. And then, in the middle of that conversation, an airport construction worker walked into the room. The airport was mid-renovation at the time, and by every indication, the man had no reason to be there other than routine maintenance work. He wasn't in uniform associated with security. He wasn't there for Lars. It should have been nothing. Instead, according to Dr. Kostov, Lars began to tremble. He shouted that he didn't want to die there, that he had to get out, and he bolted from the room. Security cameras throughout the terminal picked up what happened next in real time. Lars is seen running down the hallway, leaving behind everything he'd need to survive on his own. His suitcase, his mobile phone, his wallet, and his passport. Every single item that anchors a person to their identity and their ability to travel, to communicate, to prove who they are. He sprinted out of the terminal, across the parking area, and toward the airport's perimeter fence. He climbed it, and on the other side, he ran into the wooded, undeveloped terrain that surrounds Varna Airport and disappeared from every camera, every witness, and every piece of recorded history since. That single decision, to abandon every item that tied him to his own name, is the detail investigators keep returning to. A person planning to vanish on purpose, to start a new life somewhere else, takes their wallet, they take their phone. Lars took nothing. Whatever compelled him over that fence wasn't a plan. It looked, to everyone who has studied the footage since, like pure terror. What caused that terror has never been settled. One theory, and it's the one clinical toxicologists find at least medically plausible, centers on the antibiotic itself. Cefprozil belongs to a class of drugs called cephalosporins, and while adverse psychiatric reactions to them are exceptionally rare, they are documented in medical literature, ranging from anxiety and confusion to, in isolated case reports, acute paranoia and hallucinations. If Lars had an unusual reaction to the medication, compounded by the head trauma from the assault days earlier, it could explain both the erratic behavior in the hotel and the sudden, terrified flight at the airport. It does not, however, explain where he went afterward, or why an extensive search of the surrounding forest, conducted with dogs and drones in the days following his disappearance, turned up absolutely nothing. No clothing. No phone signal, since his was already sitting in the airport. No trail at all. The area around Varna Airport isn't a manicured park. It's dense forest that runs into coastline, dotted with old bunkers and caves left over from decades past, and populated with wildlife. Lars, by his family's account, had some experience hunting and trapping back in Germany, but even his own mother has expressed doubt about whether that experience would have been enough to survive for long out there, given the punishing summer heat and the total absence of food or shelter. In the years since, his mother Sandra has refused to let the case go cold. She's maintained a public website, Findet Lars Mittank, translating roughly to Fiend Lars Mittank, and she has personally hired a private investigator to dig into hospital admission records across the region, searching for any unidentified patient who might match her son's profile. Nothing has ever matched. She has also fielded hundreds of messages over the years from people around the world claiming to have seen him disoriented, homeless, unable to explain who he is, but not one of those sightings has ever been confirmed. The most persistent of these came in 2019, when a German truck driver came forward saying he'd picked up a hitchhiker matching Lars's description and had driven him from Dresden to the town of Schildau, in the Oberhavel district of Brandenburg. German authorities logged the report and investigated it, but it, like every other lead in this case, ultimately went nowhere. It remains open today, still classified as an active international missing persons case by both German and Bulgarian authorities, still built around the same unanswered question that's followed it since 2014. Not what happened to Lars Mittank in that forest, but what, in the span of a few seconds inside an airport clinic, made him believe he had no choice but to run into it. If a case like this is the reason you keep coming back, do us a favor before we move on. Hit like, drop a comment with your own theory, and subscribe to the Unsolved Vault so you don't miss what's coming next. Brandon Swanson. Brandon Swanson was 19 years old, a recent graduate of Marshall High School, and by the spring of 2008, he just wrapped up his first year studying wind energy at Minnesota West Community and Technical College's campus in Canby. He was, by every account from the people who knew him, exactly the kind of kid you'd want your own son to be. Responsible, grounded, close with his parents, Brian and Annette, and his younger sister back home in Marshall. On the night of May 13, 2008, Brandon stuck around Canby to celebrate the end of the semester with friends, moving between a couple of small gatherings. There had been some drinking, his friends would later confirm that much, but nobody who saw him that night believed he was dangerously intoxicated. He seemed like himself. Just before midnight, he decided it was time to make the roughly 30-mile drive home to Marshall, and rather than take the main highway, for reasons that have never been explained, he chose to cut through the back roads instead. Somewhere along that stretch of rural gravel in complete darkness, his green Chevrolet Lumina slid off the road and got hung up in a ditch. He wasn't hurt, the car had no real damage, but it was stuck at an angle steep enough that the wheels couldn't get traction, and there was nothing around him but open fields and black sky. So he did the obvious thing. He called his parents. It was around 1:54 in the morning when Brian and Annette's phone rang. Brandon told them he'd gone into a ditch on a back road somewhere north of Highway 68, and that he thought he was close to a small town called Lind, not far from home at all. His parents got in their car immediately and started driving out to find him, staying on the phone with him the entire time, trying to use his description of what he could see to narrow down his location. At one point, they flashed their headlights into the darkness, and Brandon told them he could see the flash and flashed his own lights back in response. It should have worked. It didn't. No matter which direction they drove, there was no sign of him or his car anywhere near Lind. As the minutes stretched on, the call started to fray at the edges. Both sides were exhausted and increasingly frustrated, two parents driving in circles through the dark with no landmarks to go on, and a 19-year-old growing more anxious by the minute about being stuck out there alone. At one point, Annette even hung up out of sheer frustration, then immediately called back to apologize. Eventually, Brandon told them he was going to try walking toward Lind himself, to a friend's house he thought he could reach on foot. He stayed on the line with them as he walked, describing what little he could see around him. 47 minutes after that call began, Brandon suddenly said, "Oh shit!" and the line went dead. That's it. That's the entire event. No scream, no sound of a struggle, no crash, no splash, no mechanical failure on the line, nothing that would explain what happened in the half-second between him speaking and the call simply ending. His parents tried calling back immediately. It went straight to voicemail. It has never been answered since. When morning came and Brandon still hadn't turned up, his parents reported him missing to local police, who, in one of the more painful footnotes to this entire case, told them this kind of behavior wasn't unusual for a young man his age and to give it some time before treating it as a real emergency. That delay would end up mattering enormously, because later that same day, when investigators finally pulled Brandon's cell phone records, the case cracked wide open in the worst possible way. Brandon hadn't been anywhere near Lind. His phone had been pinging off a tower near the town of Taunton, roughly 25 miles away, in an entirely different stretch of the county, along Highway 68, the road that actually led back toward Canby rather than Marshall. Every single direction his parents had searched that night had been wrong, not because of any mistake on their part, but because Brandon himself had been completely and catastrophically turned around. His car, when it was finally located around noon, was found hung up on a gravel field approach roughly a mile and a half north of Taunton, sitting almost exactly on the border where Yellow Medicine, Lincoln, and Leon counties all meet. And it's here that the geography of this case turns genuinely strange. Running near where his car was found is the Yellow Medicine River. Investigators came to believe that as Brandon walked through the dark that night, disoriented and exhausted, he was moving parallel to this river the entire time, quite possibly believing it was some other body of water entirely, a ditch, a stream, something far less dangerous than what it actually was. He never mentioned a river to his parents on the phone. If he knew he was walking beside one, he never said so. When search teams brought in dogs in the days that followed, their scent trail led with total consistency to the edge of that riverbank, and stopped. Investigators have spent years since trying to physically confirm what that trail suggests. Commercial dive teams have searched the river. High-resolution sonar equipment has scanned its bed. Search efforts returned again and again, sometimes during seasonal droughts when water levels dropped low enough to expose stretches of riverbed that hadn't been visible in years. None of it has ever turned up so much as a scrap of clothing, a shoe, his cell phone, or any trace of human remains. For a case where the physical evidence points so strongly in one direction, the total absence of any confirming discovery in that river remains its own unsolved mystery layered on top of the first. Land searches continued for years afterward, expanding well beyond the riverbank. Search teams returned to the fields every fall after harvest and every spring after the snow melted, but before planting began, a cycle that continued for years, eventually covering 122 square miles of southwestern Minnesota. In 2010, the case was formally taken over by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and it remains open and unsolved to this day. What came out of Brandon's disappearance beyond the search itself is its own part of this story. His parents were troubled, understandably, by how police initially brushed off their concerns that first morning, treating an adult son's absence as nothing more than a young man blowing off steam. So Brian and Annette took that frustration to the Minnesota State Legislature themselves, successfully lobbying for a new law requiring police to begin investigating a missing adult immediately, rather than waiting on an assumption that he'd simply turn up on his own. It passed both chambers, one of them unanimously, and in 2009, with the Swansons standing beside him, the governor signed it into law. It's known today as Brandon's Law, and it's credited with changing how missing adult cases are handled across the entire state. Brian and Annette have kept their porch light burning every single night since May 14, 2008. They've said publicly they don't expect to switch it off. Whether Brandon Swanson wandered into a river he mistook for something safer, or whether something else entirely happened in the seconds after he said those two final words, remains, to this day, completely unknown. Brian Shaffer. Brian Shaffer was 27 years old, a second-year medical student at Ohio State University, 8 years deep into the pursuit of becoming a doctor, following in the footsteps of his mother, a nurse. By every account from the people who knew him, he was well-liked, close with his father and his younger brother, deeply into music, and by the spring of 2006, he was counting down the days to a trip to Miami with his girlfriend Alexis Wagoner, scheduled to leave in just a few days. The weeks leading up to that trip had not been easy ones. 3 weeks earlier, Brian's mother had died after a battle with cancer, and the grief of that loss was still sitting heavily on the entire family. On the evening of March 31st, Brian had dinner with his father, Randy, to mark the end of the spring semester and the start of spring break. His father noticed he looked exhausted, worn down from pulling all-nighters to study for finals, and privately thought maybe Brian should skip going out that night. He never said so out loud. Instead, Brian went home and made plans to meet his friend Clint Florence for a night out. At 9 o'clock that evening, Brian walked into the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a bar in the South Campus Gateway complex on High Street, right in the heart of the University District. About an hour in, he called Alexis, who'd gone home to Toledo to see her family, before the two of them were set to fly out together. He told her he loved her. It was, as far as anyone can determine, a completely ordinary night. He and Florence had drinks, moved on to a few other bars, worked their way down toward the Arena District and the Short North, picked up another friend of Florence's named Meredith Reed along the way, and eventually all three of them circled back to where the night had started, riding the escalator back up into the Ugly Tuna Saloona at 1:15 in the morning for one last round before closing. At some point after that, Brian separated from Florence and Reed inside the bar, and at 1:55 a.m., the venue's security camera, a continuously panning unit covering the main entrance, picked him up standing just outside, talking briefly and amicably with two young women he didn't appear to know particularly well. The conversation looked relaxed. Nothing about it looked like a confrontation or a goodbye weighted with any particular meaning. After a few minutes, Brian said goodbye to the two women, turned, and walked back toward the bar's entrance, moving out of the camera's frame in the direction of the interior. He never appears on camera again. Florence and Reed waited for him when the bar closed at 2, expecting him to come down the escalator with the rest of the crowd. He didn't. Not thinking much of it at the time, since people scatter in different directions at closing time, they assumed he'd made his own way home and left without saying goodbye. It wasn't until the next day, when Brian never turned up at his apartment, didn't answer his phone, and then missed the flight to Miami he'd been looking forward to for weeks, that anyone realized something had gone seriously wrong. He was reported missing, and Columbus police opened an investigation that, 20 years later, remains unsolved. What makes this case so uniquely maddening is the security footage itself. Investigators reviewed it meticulously. Footage from the panning camera covering the main entrance and escalator, the only two ways in or out of the venue that the public would normally use. Brian is there, clearly, walking up the escalator at 1:15. He's there again outside at 1:55, talking to the two women. and then he simply isn't there anymore. No footage shows him coming back down that escalator. No footage shows him exiting through the main entrance at any point before or after the bar closed. One of the original detectives on the case later told a reporter he could say, with what he called 100% certainty, that Brian did not leave via that escalator, disguise or no disguise. So investigators turned to the building itself and found something that opened up an entirely different, far more troubling possibility. A short distance from where Brian was last seen on camera was a service door, not intended for public use, the kind of door staff might use to move between the bar and the rest of the building. That door led into a first-floor hallway, and at the time, that hallway connected directly to an active construction zone inside the building, complete with its own separate exterior exit that led out onto the street, completely outside the range of any camera. Some investigators have pointed out just how difficult that route would have been to navigate, especially for someone who'd been drinking most of the night. It wasn't a clearly marked, well-lit path. It ran through an active job site, past exposed framing and construction materials, the kind of route a sober person might struggle with in the dark, let alone someone intoxicated. But the door was there. The exit was real. And to this day, nobody has ever been able to prove whether Brian walked through it, or whether he simply vanished somewhere inside the building itself before ever reaching it. Columbus police conducted an extraordinarily thorough physical search of the building in the aftermath, according to the detective who investigated the case for years afterward. They checked crawl spaces throughout the structure. They brought in maintenance staff to remove access panels covering hidden spaces where a person, or worse, could have been concealed. They searched the roof. None of it turned up anything. In the wider search that followed, extending for miles in every direction from the bar, police and volunteers covered enormous amounts of ground and came up with nothing there either. With no physical evidence of foul play, and equally no evidence supporting the idea that Brian simply walked away on his own, investigators found themselves considering theories that didn't sit comfortably in either category. For a while, some wondered whether, still reeling from his mother's death just weeks earlier, Brian had gone off somewhere to grieve alone. But the disappearance never resolved itself the way a temporary retreat should have, and there was no indication in his life, his finances, or his relationships that he had any reason or desire to start over somewhere else. His girlfriend and his father have never accepted that explanation. Neither has his brother Derek, who has said publicly that there isn't a day that goes by he doesn't think about him. The physical evidence, or rather, the lack of it, has never wavered in 20 years. Brian's car was found still parked at his own apartment. His belongings were untouched inside. And his cell phone, his credit cards, and every bank account tied to his name have shown absolutely no activity whatsoever since the early morning hours of April 1st, 2006. Not a single call, not a single purchase, not one login, one withdrawal, one ping off a cell tower anywhere in the country. In an era where nearly everyone leaves some kind of digital trail eventually, Brian Shaffer has left none at all, for 2 full decades. Everyone present that night, with one exception, agreed to take a polygraph test and passed. Clint Florence, the friend Brian had gone out with in the first place, refused. The 2 women Brian had been speaking to just before he vanished were eventually identified, and years later revealed they'd never even been asked to take one themselves. Neither detail proves anything on its own, but both have remained open threads in a case that's had very few of them to pull on. Over the years, sightings have surfaced from around the world, and every single one has led nowhere. In 2019, an image of a homeless man in Tijuana bearing a resemblance to Brian spread across the internet and was eventually sent to the FBI for facial recognition analysis, which ruled him out. In 2021, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation released an age-progressed photograph showing what Brian might look like in his 40s. As of this year, 20 years since he walked back toward that bar entrance and out of frame, the case remains open, still classified as an active investigation by the Columbus Police Department, still anchored entirely around the same 20 minutes of footage that has been studied, frame by frame, more than almost any other piece of video in the history of American missing persons cases. 5 cases. 5 very different nights. And in every single one, the evidence isn't actually absent. It's sitting right there, waiting. Jason Landry's folded clothes, laid out with a precision that doesn't match panic. Timothy Pitzen's mother, and the botanical sediment on her tires that narrowed an entire search to one small stretch of Illinois farmland. Lars Mittank's abandoned passport sitting untouched on an airport clinic floor. Brandon Swanson's cell tower ping, 25 miles from where he thought he stood. And Brian Shaffer, caught cleanly on camera one moment and gone from every frame after. None of these are cases with no evidence. They're cases with exactly one missing variable. A name, a location, a single witness who hasn't come forward yet. That's the thread that connects all 5 of these files, and it's why none of them read like ghost stories. They read like equations with one unsolved term. That's also what makes them solvable. Not easily, not quickly, but solvable. The same way cold cases decades older than these have been closed by a single tip, a single relative who finally decided to talk, a single piece of forensic technology that didn't exist the year the case went cold. If anything in these 5 stories connects to something you know, however small it seems, the contact information for every department investigating these cases is in the description below. You don't need to have the whole answer. Sometimes one detail is the only thing an investigator has been missing for years. That's it for this one. 5 families are still waiting on the same thing you are, an answer. If one of these cases stuck with you, that's the whole point. Tell us in the comments which one we should open next. We built this channel around cases exactly like these, and there's a lot more of them still sitting in the vault. If you don't want to miss the next one, subscribing is the only way YouTube reliably tells you it's up. Hit like if this was worth your time, and we'll see you in the next file.